Well, you just missed the bang, which is a shame because I forgot to put the camera on record. It would have been nice had you heard the almighty bang that it made as the pin gave way. I don't mind telling you, it gave me a little bit of a moment. Anyway, you can see that I've taped the mandrel to the ram on the press because I was a little bit concerned that if things went awry and something moved, I didn't particularly want that piece of aluminium through my bread basket. I did stand well to the side whilst I was pumping the jack, but yeah, I'm quite pleased that it has managed to separate the crank pin. So there we go. First phase of the crank disassembly is complete, and the homemade press tools did the job. So yeah, we'll get the crank pin pushed out the other side, out the other crank wheel, the one I've got in my hand, and then we'll go from there. See you in a minute. Well, I've just reconfigured the press, and we're going to take the crank pin out of the other side of the other flywheel. So you never know, we might get another pop out of this one. So maybe you didn't miss out quite so much after all. Yay! There you go. I was beginning to feel as though I cheated you, but no, you got to see a bang. Right, or hear a bang rather. How can you see a bang? Anyway, out she pops. So let's go over to the bench and have a look at all the bits and pieces and see what they look like. Right then, back at the bench, we've got all the bits from the crank that we've just disassembled. Excuse the noise in the background, that's a heater. It's 11 degrees C in here at the moment. It was 8 when I came in. So yeah, winter is definitely upon us. Right, let's have a look. So we've got the connecting rod. Obviously we're not going to be using this again, but interesting to see how it's worn. There's no deep scratches or scores in the bearing surfaces, inside or outside. A little tiny bit of pickup there, but then we move on to the rollers. I've had a little bit of a rake through them, and nearly all of them have got a little bit of brindling and some flat spotting, so definitely due for a change. And then when we look at the crank pin itself, we can see the net effect, if you like. If I can get it to focus, you can just see that brindling there on the bearing track. Obviously once it gets through the hardened surface, it just starts coming away in big chunks. So definitely overdue for a change. And then we've got the crank wheels themselves. Not really had much of a look at these yet because they're still fairly dirty. We need to get them in the wash off and get them cleaned. Usual 2-stroke black marks and lovely 2-stroke aroma, which I really like. And then this one looks as though it's suffered a little bit. There's some scoring there, which could be an issue. We'll have to have a bit of a think about that. Yeah, get them cleaned up, and then we'll have a little bit of a think about that. But that could be a problem. So the next step is get them cleaned and give them a proper, thorough inspection. Right, so let's give these crank wheels a bit of a scrub. See what we've got. Look, looking all over myself. So just bringing off some of the carbon. I'm going to have to use something a little bit more vigorous than the wash-off brush to get the rest of it off, but I'm certainly getting the oil and most of the dirt off. Right. Okay. Give them a bit of a dry, and we'll get them on the bench for a proper dose of looking at. Right, we're back over at the bench again and looking at this flywheel. This is the one with the scoring. Now, I was a little bit concerned when I first pulled the big end out because I couldn't really see how bad it was with all the sort of dirt and gunk that was in there. Having cleaned it up, it's actually not too bad. I don't think it's too bad. I did consider a couple of options, possibly getting another flywheel. They're no longer available new, so it would have to be a second-hand one. Now, I looked on the popular auction site, and I'll be honest with you, the ones that I saw on there didn't look that much better than the one I've got, and in fact some of them were pretty rusty and pretty manky, so I think that's out the window as an option. And then I considered the possibility of machining the damage out and fitting a shim to recover the lost depth, but don't fancy my chances of swinging that in my lathe actually, and getting it in the forge and getting that on centre. I think that it's probably a little bit beyond the capability of my machine, possibly. So anyway, I've decided to live with it. I think it'll be fine. As I say, for what we're going to use this this bike for, just sort of occasional use, I think it'll be fine. So that's that. And the other flywheel at the moment is in the oven, prepping to fit the crank pin. So I've got that in the oven warming up. I know there's a number of schools of thought on heating up crankshafts prior to fitting crank pins. Some people do, some people don't. I don't think you necessarily have to, but I've done a couple of cranks now, and that is all I've done. It's just a couple, and I warmed them up, and it worked really well for me. So I don't think there's any harm in warming them up. As I say, that's the way I do it, and that's what I'm doing with this one. So once that's ready, we'll get it out of the oven and get it into the press jig, and we'll have a go at fitting the crank pin. So I'll see you over at the press in a few moments. Right, so I've got the press set up. I've got a piece of scrap aluminium in between the ram and the crank pin so that we don't do any damage. The flywheel is quite hot. Under no circumstances were the oven gloves used to get it into this workshop. That did not happen. So let's see if we can press this pin in. Making the right noises. Okay, so that's down. Excellent. So I think what I'll do now is just let it cool down, leave it in the jig to cool, and we'll come back when we're ready to fit the other half. Well, here we are. We're set up to put the second crank flywheel back on the crank assembly. All set up. The flywheel's been warmed up as per the other one. We have the relevant packer pieces fitted to try to keep the force even, at least as much as possible. Probably wasting time here chatting when I should be making use of the fact that the thing's hot, but I think we'll be all right. The jack ram is in line with the pin. Everything seems to be okay, so there's only one thing to do. Give it a go, see what happens. I'm gonna move out of the firing line a little bit because I don't really want to be wearing the crankshaft as a permanent piece of my body. Okay, right, I can immediately see that we've got a problem there. Things are starting to go on the wonk. So yeah, how am I going to stop that from happening? Right, I'll stop you there, and I'll have a little bit of a look at the setup and see if there's anything we can do to try and keep it straight. Back in a sec. Okay, we're back again. Wow. What can I say? That previous setup was suffering from well, an embarrassing number of schoolboy errors. First of all, the bearing race that I had underneath the crank was basically allowing the lower flywheel to tilt. It was slipping into a recess, and it was allowing the lower wheel to tilt. And then I was only pressing on this side of the jig. Quite how I expected it to stay level when I was only pressing on that side of the jig, I don't know, but I guess I did expect that to happen, which obviously in hindsight it was never going to do. Thankfully it hasn't moved the I was concerned that it might have tried to pull the upright beams out of the lower plate, but they still seem as though they're square. I've now got some better spacers underneath the lower flywheel in the form of these flat aluminium plates. I'm still using the same packing pieces for the upper flywheel, and I've now got a couple of pieces of quite thick walled aluminium bar which has been bored out, so it's quite thick walled over the top of the crankshaft, and I've got the arbor plate from the press sitting on top to distribute the force. So hopefully this setup will be better. Now the good news is, I'm just going to move you around a little bit, just move the whole tripod. I don't know if you can see that. The good news is that the I'm getting the tripod caught on the press. The good news is that the pin had actually started to go in, and when the jig started to tilt and I stopped, that was the right time to stop, because the pin is reasonably square in the upper flywheel, so we shouldn't have any problems moving forward, providing that this setup that I've got now allows it to go down evenly. So there's only one way to find out. Stand well clear and pump the lever, see what happens. Here we go. Can't see what's happening there. Now it's still wanting to tilt, so I'm not going to go any further than that. I think I'm going to have to find some means of supporting this side of the flywheel. I'm going to have another bit of a head scratch, I think, because that is not going down level at all. So before we damage the crank or damage the fixture, I think we'll stop there, have a bit of a think. Alright, okay, we're back. I think I found the sweet spot. I've been messing around with the setup, and it's taken me a while to find out exactly where to put the force. But as you can see, I've got the two aluminium cylinders over the top of the crankshaft. I'm now pressing slightly outboard, slightly towards the rod of the center line, and that's the sweet spot. That's where the force is doing its thing. It's doing the right thing, and the crank wheel is moving down in a nice uniform fashion, which was exactly what I wanted. So we got there in the end. Probably some improvements on the design that can be made, but it does seem to be working. So let's crack on, finish off, and get this crank pressed down, and we'll go from there. There we go. Okay, I think that is it. I think we're down, so we will liberate the crank from the press jig and have a look at it. Well, here we are. We've got the assembled crank up on some V-blocks. I've fitted the new main bearings to the journals so that it moves nice and freely. I've got the DTI set up right on the end of the taper, so it's running on a plain portion, it's not running on a taper, and I've got it zeroed at the, almost zeroed, there we go, at the lowest point of the travel. Now, why haven't I set it up in the lathe? We'll come to that. There's a very good reason why it's not set up in the lathe, and in order to figure that out, I'm going to take you handheld for a moment, and we're going to go and have a look at the service sheet, BSA service sheet that I have over here. And I'm very fortunate to have these service sheets, and this is the original set of BSA service sheets for the 125, 150, 175 two-stroke D group models, which is the Bantam range of machines. And these were my granddad's books. I've got some BSA and I've got some Triumph ones, and I've had these since I was about 11 years old, when he decided it was time for me to become the custodian. He was no longer working on bikes at that time, so he handed them on to me, and I'm very privileged to have them and to be using them to fix old bikes just like he did. So yeah, a fantastic reference, and a real source of nostalgia and pride for me as well, as I'm sure you'll imagine. Now, as you can see, the setup there with the V-blocks and the bearings, that's how BSA decided it should be done, and so that's the way I'm doing it. Now, I did actually start off in the lathe. It didn't work out, and when we get back over to the crank, I'll show you why. But this is a really interesting picture because it shows the service tool that BSA made for assembling the flywheels, and it's the same tool that you would use for disassembling the flywheels. It's a really handy piece of kit, and if I could find one, I would snap it up in an instant, but I think they'll be few and far between these days. But as for truing up, there's three main areas that, excuse me, got a cold, that BSA tell you to concentrate on, and that is the rims, the flywheel faces, and in the text tells you to true up the shafts. So it's the tolerances are 4 thousandths on the rims, 6 thousandths on the faces, and 2 thousandths on the shafts. And so that's the numbers that we're going to be shooting for, although I have to say, when I had the crank apart, I had the flywheels in the 4-jaw chuck on the lathe, and I checked the shafts against the individual flywheels, and I found that there was about 1.5 thousandths run out already in the shafts. So I think that the 2 thousandths maximum might be quite hard to achieve. So if I can get to 3, which is sort of a combination of the two shafts at 1.5, I think I'll be happy with that. There's just one more picture I'd like to show you in this book, and that's the Disassembly Rig, and that's, as you can see, it's the same tool. It's tool 613206, and that's them pressing out the crank pin. And as you can see, they advocate the use of a hand-powered arbor press. And now I think that tells us something about that generation of people that came before us, and in my case came before my parents. And I think that if you recall the loud crack that the crank pin made when I used the hydraulic press, and the amount of force I had to put into it, if you can replicate that with a hand arbor press, then I don't want to meet you on a dark night. But I think that if you've been through the Great Depression and a World War, pressing a crank pin is probably a day at the races, I would think. But it's a big salute to that generation. They truly were, in my opinion, the greatest generation that ever lived, and clearly they were hard as nails, because they were pressing crank pins out with brute strength and thinking nothing of it. But right, we'll go back over to the bench, and I'll put the camera back in the stand, and we'll have a look at this crankshaft. Excuse my fingers in the way there. There we go. Right. So how successful was the press jig that I made? Well, I think reasonably successful is the answer. I've got the crankshaft now at the lowest point on the clock. Excuse me. And if I just turn the shaft around 180 degrees, the highest point is there, with the crank pin at the bottom, 6 o'clock position. Can I zoom that in a little bit and give you guys a bit of a better view? Maybe a little bit. There we go. I don't know if that's any better for you. So what I'm getting there is about, well, just short of 8 thousandths of an inch, which isn't fantastic, but isn't the end of the world. Now, the research that I've done and experiments that I've done, messing around, I've discovered that certain positions tell you certain things. If I had the high point with the crankshaft pin at the top, I would be looking at a spread crankshaft, which means that the area diametrically opposite from the crank pin would be spread. Because I'm looking at the highest point with the crank pin at the bottom, 6 o'clock position, I'm looking at a pinched crank pin. Pinched crankshaft, which means the flywheels are closer together here than they are at the crank pin. And if you imagine the shafts sticking out of the crankshaft, if it's pinched at the top, they're doing this. If it's spread at the top, right now they'd be doing this. So with the crank pin at the top, they'd be doing this, and the highest point would be with the crank pin at the top. But obviously at the moment we're looking at a pinched crank pin. Now that's my fault, because I didn't come up with a wedge or a stop to prevent the flywheels from coming together too closely when I pressed the crank together. I was relying on the fact that it would stop when it hit the extreme of travel on the crank pin, when it hit the wider portion, but I didn't consider the pinching effect that I would get at the other side, and I should have done, because I've watched enough crank videos to know that that's what would happen. But I just got all excited and battered on, and now I've got a pinched crankshaft to deal with. So we need to fix that, and the way to do it is to drive a wedge in between these two flywheels here and actually splay them apart. And that's going to be a bit of a trial and error process. There's no sort of science behind it, or if there is, I don't know it. So I need to make a suitable wedge to do that. Now I don't actually have any stock in the workshop at the moment that I can use, so I'm going to have to scrounge around and see if I can find something to do the job, and that's a job that I'll do off camera, and I'll figure it out, because it's going to take quite a bit of clouting of the wedge and remeasuring and messing around in order to get that right. Now the other way that the crank could be slightly off is that the wheels can be out of truth with each other. They can be skewed. So we've got pinched, spread and skewed. Now I was hoping that they wouldn't be, because the whole purpose of the jig that I built was to try and keep them in line, but I think it's inevitable that there would have been some flex, particularly as I didn't get the sweet spot of pressing the crank together right first time, and I probably introduced a little bit of flex by getting the force in the wrong place and pressing. Well, you remember from the earlier point of the video where the crank wasn't pressing together, but everything was kind of going a bit on the wonk. So I'm going to get the pinch out of the crank first, and then measure for skew, because at the moment, if I put the crank pin at the 3 o'clock position, I'm getting about 3 and a bit thousandths, and if I put the crank pin here at the 9 o'clock position, I'm getting about the same. So it might well be that what we're seeing there is some effect from the pinching of the flywheels, because obviously they're not just pinched at the top, it has circumference as well as diameter, and that issue there will have some bearing all the way around the crankshaft. And the fact that that's about 4 thousandths and that's about 8 thousandths, which when I went to school is about half, makes me think that the pinch is actually causing that problem, and I might not be far out with skew. And if that's the case, then my alignment jig has been quite successful, and the error has been introduced by me not doing a very good job of pressing the crank together, which I think is probably fair. If I do get an issue with skew, I have a trusty lead mallet which I can use to bring the wheels back into line. And again, doing a little bit of research and messing around with drawings, I figured out that if my crank pin's at 3 o'clock, i.e. furthest away from me, then the error is in the left hand crank wheel, and if it's closest to me, the error, and I get a high reading, the error would be in the right hand crank wheel. So I put the crank pin to the top, and obviously not in the V blocks because I don't want to damage the journals, but I would strike it there, and when if it was the problem was there, I would strike it there. But at the moment I'm hopeful that the error is just in pinch, and obviously I'll have to do both sides of the crankshaft, but when I had the clock over on the other end, just to check, I was getting about 2.5 thou, which would be acceptable, but it just depends on how things are once I've got the pinch out of the wheels. So I hope that makes sense. I hope it's been interesting to you to see my endeavours with this particular project. As I say, I won't film the correction. I'll just show you. The results, and hopefully the next time you see a video with the crankshaft in it, we'll be bolting it between the crankcases with the bearings fitted, and we'll be measuring and setting the end flow, which on the Bantam you set with shims either side of the crank, and there's a tolerance for end flow that needs to be met. So that's another job to do. I'm going to end the video now because I think I've rambled on for quite a while on this one, but I just want to say thanks very much indeed for watching. Thanks for sticking with me on this. I said in one of my earlier videos that I wasn't really a YouTuber, but I'm really enjoying making these videos, and I think that kind of makes me a YouTuber. I think I have to admit that I am one, and we're up to 65 subscribers now, which probably doesn't seem like a lot to some of you guys, but to me that's phenomenal. That 65 people are sort of happy to watch me waffle on in the shed. It's great. I love it. Thank you very much indeed. So all to existing and new subscribers, thank you. If you're watching, you found my channel and you like what you see, and you haven't subscribed, then please do. Now that I'm a YouTuber, it's all grist to the mill, and it will help. It'd be fantastic to get to 100 and see if we could get there. That would be great. Please click the like, and please feel free to leave a comment. If you think I'm doing it right, then please tell me. If you think there's a better way, then again, please tell me. This isn't a how-to video. This is how I'm doing it and how I'm figuring it out. So comments are always very, very welcome. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.